In the heart of a bustling Indian city, where the chaos of honking horns and chai-wallas filled every street corner, lived a young man whose world was about to change forever. His name was Arjun, a quiet and unassuming 19-year-old whose life until this point had been defined by the dusty cricket pitches of his local Maidan and the constant low-grade pressure of his family's expectations. His father, a retired army man with a back bent from years of service, ran a small general store, and his mother, a woman with tired eyes and a gentle smile, managed their modest home. For them, Arjun's future was a clear, if unexciting, path. Finish his studies, get a steady job, perhaps in an office, and live a safe, predictable life. But a flicker of something else, a memory of pride, resided in his father's heart. A hope that his son might one day understand the discipline and honor of a uniform. Arjun, however, felt trapped by this very predictability. He was an average student, his mind often wandering from textbooks to the vast open skies he glimpsed from his rooftop. He felt a pull toward something undefined, a yearning for a challenge that the cramped lanes of his neighborhood could never provide. The monotony was broken one afternoon when a poster, plastered on a crumbling wall near the post office, caught his eye. It was for the Indian Army, a recruitment drive, and at its center was the insignia of a sniper, a lone figure, almost invisible, holding a rifle that seemed an extension of his very being. The image stirred something deep within Arjun, a feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just about joining the army. It was about the solitude, the intense focus, the idea of a single, perfect moment that could change the course of things. The decision to apply was met with a wave of resistance at home. His mother worried about the dangers, painting pictures of snowbound frontiers and hostile encounters. His father, while secretly a little proud, voiced practical concerns. "It's not a game, Arjun," he said, his voice rough. "It's years of hardship. And you've never even held a real rifle. This sniper business, it's for the chosen few, the ones with a God-given gift. What makes you think you have it in you?" The question hung in the air, a challenge that both stung and motivated Arjun. He didn't have an answer, only a quiet, stubborn belief that he needed to try. Now he wanted to step out of the long shadow of an ordinary life and test himself against something immense. So, against the advice of almost everyone he knew, he filled out the form, his hand trembling slightly as he wrote his name. He was about to embark on a journey for which he had no map, no training, and no real reason to believe he would succeed. The first step was the physical recruitment test, a brutal weeding-out process held at a dusty, sprawling parade ground on the outskirts of the city. Thousands of young men, a sea of hopeful faces had gathered, all vying for a handful of positions. The atmosphere was thick with nervous energy and the acrid smell of sweat. For Arjun, who had spent most of his life hunched over books or playing leisurely cricket, it was a trial by fire. The running, the push-ups, the obstacle course. Each task pushed him to his absolute limit. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed in protest, and more than once, the thought of giving up, of returning to the comfort of his home, flashed through his mind. He was not the strongest, nor the fastest. He saw boys built like athletes, clearing obstacles with ease, their confidence radiating. He, on the other hand, felt clumsy, his body an awkward vessel for his determined spirit. But something kept him going. It wasn't physical strength, but a raw, unyielding will. When his vision blurred during the long-distance run, he focused on the back of the man in front of him. When his arms gave way during the push-ups, he thought of his father's stoic silence. He scraped his knees on the obstacle course, drawing blood, but pulled himself up and continued. And he wasn't competing against the other boys, he was fighting his own limitations. By the end of the day, exhausted and battered, he was one of the few still standing, having scraped through by the narrowest of margins. The officer who handed him his provisional selection letter barely glanced at him. But for Arjun, that piece of paper felt like a golden ticket. He had passed the first test, a test he was never supposed to pass, and in doing so, he had tasted a new kind of strength, the strength of sheer perseverance. The next stage was the written exam, a different kind of challenge. Arjun was not a brilliant scholar, but he was diligent. He spent his nights hunched over borrowed books, memorizing facts about history, geography, and general knowledge. The constant pressure was immense. He knew that his physical performance, now while enough to get him through the first round, was not exceptional. He needed to compensate in the written test. The exam hall was silent, save for the rustling of papers and the frantic scribbling of pens. Arjun worked methodically, carefully reading each question, drawing on weeks of exhausted study. He didn't finish with a surge of confidence, but with a quiet hope that he had done enough. When the results were finally announced, his name was there, listed towards the end. He was in. He had officially been selected for training, and more specifically, his scores and psychological profile had flagged him for a potential new path, the sniper course. The news sent a jolt through his family. His mother cried, a mix of fear and pride. His father simply placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of affection that spoke volumes. The ordinary boy from the crowded city was now a soldier in the making, about to enter a world of extraordinary discipline and danger. The transition from civilian life to the military academy was a violent shock to Arjun's system. The training camp was located in the foothills of the Himalayas, a place of breathtaking beauty and brutal reality. The air was thin and cold, a stark contrast to the humid, heavy air of his hometown. The first few weeks were a blur of relentless physical activity, designed to break down individuals and rebuild them as a cohesive unit. There were no more individual identities. Everyone was a trainee, a number, a body to be molded. The instructors, hardened men with voices like gravel and eyes that missed nothing, seemed to take a particular delight in pushing the new recruits to their breaking point. Arjun, he already considered physically average, struggled immensely. The high-altitude runs left him gasping for air, his legs feeling like lead. The weapons training was intricate and demanding, requiring a level of precision and calm he didn't know he possessed. He watched in awe and despair as some of his peers, often from rural backgrounds with years of physical labor behind them, excelled. They adapted to the terrain, the drills, and the harsh discipline with a natural ease. Arjun, the city boy, was constantly catching up, always one step behind. He made mistakes, fumbled with his rifle during drills, and was singled out for punishment more times than he could count. The nights were the hardest. Lying on his hard bunk, his body aching, he would listen to the wind howling outside and question why he was there. And the dream that had seemed so noble and clear back in his city now felt like a distant, foolish fantasy. He missed the warmth of his home, the familiar sounds of the street, his mother's cooking. The gnawing doubt that he didn't belong, that his father had been right, became a constant companion. The turning point came during a particularly grueling navigation exercise. The trainees were dropped in an unfamiliar part of the forest, given a map, a compass, and a set of coordinates to reach by nightfall. Arjun, paired with a boisterous and overconfident trainee from Punjab named Gurpreet, quickly found himself lost. Gurpreet, trusting his instincts over the map, led them in the wrong direction. As the sun began to dip below the dense canopy, a sense of panic set in. They were lost, cold, and running out of time. It was then that Arjun's quieter nature took over. He stopped, took a deep breath, and ignored Gurpreet's frantic suggestions. He focused on the map, carefully orienting it and using the compass to take a bearing. He identified a distant ridge line and a stream that matched the topography. With a calm he didn't feel, he took the lead, carefully picking their way through the undergrowth. They reached the designated point just as the last light faded, finding the instructor waiting for them, a flicker of surprise in his otherwise stoic expression. For the first time, Arjun had not just survived, he had led. He had used patience and precision over brute force, and it had worked. This small victory planted a seed of confidence. From that day on, Arjun began to find his footing. He realized that his strength wasn't in matching the physical prowess of others, but in his growing mental fortitude. He started to excel in the classroom sessions on tactics, map reading, and fieldcraft. He had a natural ability to focus, to block out distractions, to think several steps ahead. When the time came for the first live-fire exercises, his instructors began to take notice. He wasn't the fastest to fire, but he was the most deliberate. He didn't waste ammunition. He observed the wind, checked his sight picture repeatedly, and made each shot count. There was a calmness about him on the firing range that was rare in a new recruit. It was as if the chaos of the world fell away, leaving only the target, the rifle, and him. This quiet competence set him apart. The boy who was always playing catch-up was now subtly, quietly, pulling ahead. The culmination of the initial training was the selection process for the specialized sniper course. It was a notoriously difficult program with a staggeringly high dropout rate. Only a handful from each batch were even considered. The psychological pressure was immense. Candidates were subjected to sleep deprivation, stress positions, and complex problem-solving tasks while exhausted. They were evaluated not just on their marksmanship, but on their patience, their ability to remain utterly still for hours, their judgment, and their emotional stability. Arjun watched as many of his physically stronger peers cracked under the pressure. They grew angry, frustrated, or simply gave up. But Arjun found a strange reservoir of calm within himself. The years of quiet endurance in his crowded city life, the feeling of being an outsider, had somehow prepared him for this. He could wait. He could observe. He could absorb stress without it breaking his focus. When the final list was posted, his name was on it. He had been selected for the elite sniper training program. The ordinary boy was now on the path to becoming one of the Army's most formidable weapons. The sniper training facility was a world away from the main camp. It was nestled deeper in the mountains, a place of stark, isolated beauty. The air was even thinner, the silence more profound. The trainees, now a small elite group, were introduced to their new instructors, men who were legends in their own right, veterans with countless covert operations to their names. Chief among them was Hawaldar Major Ranjit Singh, and a man whose face was a roadmap of weathered skin and whose eyes held the calm, predatory gaze of a hawk. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were precise and carried the weight of absolute authority. He didn't just teach them how to shoot. He taught them how to become ghosts, how to merge with the environment, how to think like the bullet before it was ever fired. The first lessons were a humbling experience for Arjun. His marksmanship, which had seemed impressive in basic training, was now picked apart and rebuilt from the ground up. Hawaldar Major Ranjit stressed that a sniper's greatest weapon wasn't the rifle, but his mind. He taught them about ballistics, the way the Coriolis effect could subtly alter a bullet's path over a long distance, and how to read the wind by observing the sway of a blade of grass or the shimmer of heat haze. They learned to calculate range using a scope's mil dots, a complex mathematical exercise that had to be done quickly and accurately under pressure. For hours, they would lie motionless in the scorching sun or the biting cold, practicing the art of camouflage and concealment, learning to control their breathing until their heartbeats slowed to a crawl. They were taught to disappear, to become a part of the rock and the earth. Arjun struggled with the physical stillness at first. His body would cramp. An itch would become maddening, and the temptation to shift his weight by a millimeter was overwhelming, but he learned to master it through mental discipline. He would focus on a single point in the distance, a leaf, a rock. and then let his mind drift, detaching himself from the discomfort of his body. He began to see the world differently, not as a landscape, but as a series of vantage points, firing positions, and potential hiding spots. He learned to move like a shadow, crawling on his belly for hundreds of meters, using every fold in the terrain for cover. He learned to build a hide, a concealed observation post from which he could watch and wait for days if necessary, undetected. This was a world of immense patience, where a single careless movement could mean death. The bond between the trainees deepened during this period. They were no longer competitors, but a brotherhood, united by shared hardship and a common goal. There was Ravi, a stoic young man from a village in Uttar Pradesh, whose patience seemed infinite, and Vikram, a fiery but fiercely loyal soldier from Rajasthan. They pushed each other, supported each other, and learned from each other's strengths. During a long, cold night spent in a mock hide, waiting for a simulated target, Arjun and Ravi would whisper stories of their homes, their families, their reasons for being there. It was in these quiet moments of shared vulnerability that the true strength of their bond was forged. They were learning that a sniper, for all his solitude, was still part of a team, relying on his spotter and his fellow soldiers for survival. The climax of this phase was the final live-fire exercise in the high-altitude desert. They were given a set of coordinates and told to eliminate a series of hidden targets across a vast, unforgiving valley, all while being hunted by a team of elite counter-sniper instructors. It was a test of everything they had learned. Arjun and his spotter, Ravi, moved with painstaking slowness, using the terrain to mask their approach. They located their first target, a small, almost invisible metal plate over 2 kilometers away. Arjun settled into his position, adjusted for the thin air, the wind, and the angle. He took a deep breath, let half of it out, and held it. The world narrowed to the crosshairs on his scope. He applied a slow, steady pressure on the trigger. The crack of the rifle shattered the silence, echoing across the valley. Through his scope, he saw a small puff of dust as the bullet struck the target dead center. A wave of elation washed over him, but he quickly suppressed it. There was no time for celebration. The shot had given away their position. The hunt was now on. They had to move, and fast. The real test had just begun. The moment Arjun's bullet found its mark, the tranquil valley transformed into a deadly chessboard. The crack of his rifle was like a starting pistol for the counter-sniper team, and the game of cat and mouse began. He and Ravi knew they had only seconds before the instructors would have a fix on their general location. They immediately initiated their escape plan, a pre-agreed route that involved crawling through a shallow, rocky nulla, a dry stream bed that offered the only concealment in the immediate area. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows that were both a friend and an enemy. They moved with agonizing slowness, each scrape of their uniform on the rocks sounding like an avalanche in the profound silence. Their hearts pounded, not just from exertion, but from the primal fear of being hunted. For the next 2 hours they moved, stopped, observed, and moved again. They would freeze for 20 minutes at a time, scanning the opposite ridges with their binoculars, looking for any sign of the hunters. A misplaced shadow, a glint of glass, a bird taking flight unexpectedly. The instructors were masters of their craft. They left no trace, made no sound. The pressure was immense, a constant gnawing presence at the back of Arjun's mind. This was the ultimate test of the mental conditioning he had undergone. He had to remain calm, analytical, and trust his training. The fear was a tool, he reminded himself, a source of heightened awareness, not a paralyzing force. He recalled Hawaldar Major Ranjit's words, "In the field, a sniper's greatest enemy is not the one with the rifle, but the panic in his own mind. Control that, and you control the battle." They had 2 more targets to hit, and their positions were far from where they currently were. Reaching them meant crossing a treacherous open stretch of ground, a gravel flat with no cover. It was a kill zone. They waited until the last vestiges of light were gone, cloaking the valley in an inky blackness. Under the cover of a moonless night, they made their move, crawling on their bellies across the open ground. It was a nerve-shredding experience. Every loose stone that clinked under their weight, every sharp pebble that dug into their skin, was a potential betrayal. They moved inch by inch, pausing frequently to listen. The silence was so profound it seemed to have a sound of its own, a low hum in their ears. And it took them over 3 hours to cross a distance of just 500 meters. By the time they reached the base of the next ridge, they were exhausted, their muscles screaming, but they were alive and, most importantly, undetected. The second target was perched on a cliff face, a difficult shot made even more complex by swirling winds. As they set up their position in the pre-dawn gloom, Ravi, using a handheld anemometer, reported wildly fluctuating wind speeds. It would be a shot of pure instinct and feel. Arjun knew he would have to wait for the precise moment when the wind steadied, even for a fraction of a second. He lay there, cheek welded to the stock of his rifle, his breathing so shallow he was barely taking in air. The crosshairs danced over the distant target. He waited. Minutes felt like hours, and the sun began to crest the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. And then it happened. A brief, almost imperceptible lull in the wind. In that sliver of a moment, Arjun's finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle bucked, and the crack echoed. Through his scope, he saw the target spin and fall. A perfect hit, but the shot had cost them. It had pinpointed their new location. Within minutes, they heard the faint, distant sound of movement, a boot on a loose stone, a whispered command carried on the wind. The hunters were closing in. They had one target left, but it was also the most exposed. To get to it, they would have to summit the ridge they were on, silhouetting themselves against the skyline. It was a desperate gamble. With no other option, they decided to move, not away from the sound, but towards it, hoping to use the hunter's own advance to create a blind spot. It was a high-risk, high-reward maneuver that relied on audacity and split-second timing. As they crested a small saddle in the ridge, they came face to face with the reality of their situation. Below them, not 200 meters away, they saw two instructors moving with silent precision, their rifles scanning the terrain. Arjun and Ravi froze, melting into the rocks, praying that their camouflage would hold. They were close enough to see the details on the instructors' packs. The hunters had become the hunted, at least for this one terrifying, exhilarating moment. The instructors passed within 50 meters of their position, their eyes scanning the higher ground, never once looking down at the seemingly innocuous pile of rocks and scrub that concealed the two trainees. Arjun could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic drum in his ears, and was terrified it would give them away. He focused on controlling his breathing, making each inhale and exhale as shallow and silent as possible. Ravi, lying just a few feet away, was a statue. They remained frozen for what felt like an eternity after the instructors had moved past, not daring to even blink. The hunters, confident in their sweep, had moved on, believing the ridge ahead was the only viable path. Arjun and Ravi had used the oldest trick in the book. They had hidden in plain sight, in the very ground that had already been cleared. They waited a full 30 minutes after the last sound of movement faded before daring to move. Every muscle in Arjun's body screamed in protest as he slowly, carefully extracted himself from his position. And they now had a new problem. The hunters were between them and their final target. To get to it, they would have to either go through them or find an impossibly covert route around. They chose the latter. Using the terrain map they had memorized, they identified a narrow, treacherous goat trail that skirted the edge of a sheer cliff on the valley's far side. It was a path so dangerous that it wasn't even marked as a route. It was their only chance. The traverse was a nightmare of exposed ledges and crumbling rock. With their heavy packs and rifles, one wrong step would send them plunging hundreds of feet. They moved one at a time, Ravi covering Arjun as he edged along the cliff face, then Arjun covering Ravi. The wind, which had been their enemy, now howled around them, threatening to pluck them from the rock face. And the physical and mental strain was beyond anything they had experienced. After what seemed like hours, they finally made it across and began their ascent to the final firing point. They were behind the hunters now, having completed a wide, perilous loop that had brought them to the opposite side of the valley. The final target was the most challenging of all, a small, circular plate placed in a dark, shadowed crevice at the base of a distant rock formation. It was almost invisible. The light was beginning to fail again, and a light, persistent drizzle began to fall, misting their scopes and making the already difficult shot a test of sheer optical and mental clarity. They had one chance. If they missed, the sound would bring the hunters down on them with no escape route left. Arjun settled into his final position, using Ravi's pack to create a stable shooting platform. The rain streaked his scope, and he had to wipe it clear every few seconds. Ravi was struggling to get a precise wind reading due to the swirling precipitation. The target, over 1,800 meters away, was a ghost in the fading light. Arjun closed his eyes for a moment, blocking out the rain, the cold, the exhaustion. He visualized the shot, the bullet's trajectory, the impact. He thought of all the hours of training, the patience, the pain, the discipline. He thought of his father's doubtful question, "What makes you think you have it in you?" This was his answer. He opened his eyes. The world narrowed to a single point. He took a deep breath, let it out, and held it as the crosshairs settled on the faint, almost imperceptible shape of the target. He felt for the rhythm of his heart, waiting for the natural pause between beats. He applied pressure to the trigger. The rifle roared, a sound of defiance against the wind and rain. The bullet traveled for over 2 seconds, a lifetime in the world of snipers. Through his scope, Arjun saw a small chip of rock fly from the cliff face just beside the target. He had missed. For a split second, a cold dread washed over him. But then Ravi, who had been watching through his own powerful spotting scope, whispered, "No. Wait. Look." The target, which had been partially obscured by the crevice's shadow, had moved. Arjun's shot had struck the rock right next to it, and the impact had dislodged the plate from its precarious perch. It wasn't a direct hit, but the mission was to eliminate the target, and the target was no longer in place. It had been neutralized. By the strictest interpretation of the exercise, he had succeeded. A wave of profound relief and disbelief flooded through him. They had done it. They had completed the mission against all odds. Now, they just had to survive the journey back.